should be going live right now.
Not yet.
I just switch off the ping when somebody's joining.
Live right now. It
Yeah.
shows to me
Now
like
you're
we're
live.
live, right? We're okay? We're okay?
I just switch off
Yes.
the ping when somebody's joining.
Yes, of course, please. As we get started, please mute yourself. Something changed. I mean, we have a mishap, and we're actually using the Zoom link for something different, not for the finds. So I forgot to edit some of the configuration of this link. That's why you're not muted as you walk in. So please, those who haven't, if you can mute yourself, only for the first hour, then we definitely want to hear from you and open up those mics. So being already 11 o'clock New York time, whatever time it is where your life finds you, welcome you all to another fantastic, exciting, and promising presentation of the FIND seminar series. It is fantastic. It's a treat for me to have today the presence of my colleague and friend, Anthony Di Fiore. And today, Tony will be presenting a talk titled Agent-Based Simulation Modeling for Studying Primate Behavior and Social Evolution. And I could take the whole hour to either share anecdotes that will make Tony proud of what he's done. So, but I have to refrain myself from not spending too much time going on over the long history that we have together with Tony. So what I was thinking, I just make a couple of comments about Tony's background and his career, and then relate some of what I know about him to the talk that he's going to be presenting today. Tony completed his undergraduate degree at Cornell University in New York. He's originally from New York. I was confused. I thought Tony had been born in Washington, D.C. He did the undergraduate in Cornell, then did his PhD in UC Davis in the Department of Anthropology. That's where we met. And after that, he completed a postdoc at the Smithsonian Institution. And it was then, I mean, you may be thinking of Tony today. This is to our young colleagues in the audience. Tony really decided to really change gears and become very, very proficient on genetics as he started his postdoc. He had not done genetics before that. And it was only when he was doing his postdoc that he went to the Smithsonian and spent a couple of years there and really became and developed this skill set that makes him today a renowned molecular geneticist. After that, he spent about a decade as a professor at New York University. And it was in 2011 that he moved to the University of Texas at Austin, and he's been there since then. I had the opportunity to review his CV, not because I don't know Tony's history well, but it's refreshing, it's exciting to see how much he's done. And of course, he has no shortage of publications, really getting close to 200 publications when you combine his publications in edited volumes and peer-reviewed publications. He's done also equally well regarding funding. He has been working in Tiputini, Ecuador for more than 20 years, and he's funded that almost by himself. We've also done work together that we funded jointly, and he has all kinds of collaborations across Central and South America that have required successful funding efforts. In terms of his prestige and awards, what I want to share with you, something that I didn't get from CV. I mean, I was looking at his CV from a few months ago, but I should have looked at his CV from yesterday because it was only this past week that he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He became a member of the National Academy of Sciences in the US last year, and he's a fellow also of AAAS. Those are just the most recent, very impressive accolades that Tony has in his CV. He has, my goodness, a long list of scholars and young colleagues who has advised, both as undergrads, masters, PhD students, spanning every single country you can name, going from the US down to Argentina. Regarding today, and now I want to transition us to the topic per se. I mean, he's discussing agent-based simulation modeling in relationship to one of the central areas of research for him, which is really trying to understand the evolution of social and mating systems in primates with attention to a phylogenetic context. But Tony's not doing agent-based simulation because we're all trying to do something with computer science in the last 5 or 10 years. I remember he was a grad student, and he was back then the only one of us who was already very, very committed to understanding computing and coding and writing program. So this is, I mean, he has under his belt not just 5 or 10 years of thinking how to tap on computer resources for understanding social evolution. He has 3 decades of thinking and doing that. And so I'm sure that we're going to have a fantastic talk where he shares with us how we can really tap on these computing resources to advance our understanding of the evolution of social and mating system in primates, and therefore by extension in all kinds of living organisms. With that, I will defer to Tony to take it from here. It's my great pleasure to welcome you, Tony. So please, it's all yours.
So Eduardo, can you just confirm if I'm sharing my screen okay?
Screen is looking good, volume is good, you're ready to go.
Okay, so when Eduardo asked me to do this talk, I was admittedly kind of tired of talking about primate behavioral biology and genetics, and so I decided to go in a bit of a different direction with this, and thus kind of returning to something that I, as Eduardo mentioned, has spent some time on a very long time ago working on. So, you know, many of you know that I spent the last 30 years or so living and working in lowland Ecuador. And in those places in lowland Ecuador, I work on the lands and territories of various indigenous peoples, particularly the Guarani and Quechua. And so I have to say, you know, throughout my career, I've been fortunate and immensely grateful for the opportunities I've had to do that work. And I work now in Austin. And I want to say that I also acknowledge, value, respect the American Indian indigenous peoples and communities who have been or become part of the lands and territories here in Austin. So I want to just make sure that I acknowledge that before we move on. Now, let's see if I can advance here. Eduardo, thank you very much for that introduction. My ears were burning a little bit. This is a picture of Eduardo and I a very long time ago. As I mentioned, I work in lowland Ecuador, and I was brought to this beautiful place in 1991 by Peter Rodman, who I am delighted to see is here in the audience. It's an incredibly diverse place. There are 10 different species of non-human primates that coexist there. And so this is 8 of them. Some of you may know that I've worked mostly on spider monkeys and woolly monkeys throughout my career. So those are spider monkeys and woolly monkeys. But I don't really want to talk about actual monkeys today. I will say that, you know, the focus that I've had on agent-based modeling going back a long time, and I'll get to that history in just a second, you know, is prompted by this incredible diversity that we see in non-human primate social systems in places like the Western Amazon, other parts of the equatorial tropics. But for today, I want to return to something you know, that I began working on almost to the day 29 years ago with Peter Rodman. It was the very first piece of academic work that I did as a first and second year graduate in total collaboration with Peter, who was a generative and inspiring mentor. And I went back and grabbed the abstract from that paper, and that's what you see, or from that presentation at the American Association of Physical Anthropology meetings. Peter and I were really interested in looking at group size and the various socioecological factors that influence group size in primates. So we developed, in my first 2 years of graduate school, an agent-based simulation model, although I don't think, Peter, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we ever used the term agent-based simulation model at that time. And here's kind of the the distillation of that model, right? We're examining the effects of group size and resource dispersion on foraging efficiency with a simulation model that consists of a forest, which contains food patches that have variable density, distribution, size, renewal rates. There's a population of primates, of N individuals arranged in big N groups that forage in that forest with variable food detection distances, feeding rates, maximal meal size, et cetera. And what Peter and I were interested in doing is trying to see, okay, if we can manipulate some of these variables that we think are important, that influence grouping patterns in non-human primates in a simulated way, and calculate the efficiency of primates foraging in that simulated forest, could we get some insight into the ecological factors that help shape primate group size? And I think I'd be lying to say we came up with stunning results. We didn't come up with amazing, consistent results that were in accord with what socioecological theory suggested. And I chalk that up to our, or at least I'll chalk it up to my modeling naivete at that time. But it was a fun exercise. It was incredibly rewarding and intellectually exciting. And around the same time that we were doing that, I was nerding out on artificial life literature. So in 1991 and 1993, two important books, kind of compilations of proceedings of a conference on simulation of adaptive behavior from animals to animats came out, and I devoured these things. Eduardo talked about my being a bit of a computer nerd. I totally was. And then most exciting for me in 1994, as Peter and I, after we had presented some of our work, Peter had us read this paper. And this paper, Self-Structuring in Artificial Chimpanzees, offers new hypotheses for male grouping in chimps. It hit me like a brick. I thought it was the coolest paper imaginable. This is a quote from that paper. The rationale behind the chimp model, the agent-based simulation model that Oakhurst and Hogeberg put together, was to find out whether chimpanzees' social-like structure, a fission-fusion society in which females are predominantly solitary and males group especially with each other, can emerge from simple rules about looking for food and mates in a structured environment without resorting to the usual sociobiological, I would add in socioecological, cost-benefit assumptions about relatedness and neighboring. So this was really, really cool. I heard something. Is it okay? I can't see anybody's.
You're okay.
Okay, cool. So here's just a little bit of the kind of details of this model. Virtual chimpanzees wander around this virtual forest looking for fruiting trees. When females but not males are unable to find one, instead of looking for fruit, they look for protein sources, and males do something different than females do in this virtual world. In precedence to foraging, they look for females. If they see another chimp and that chimp's female and in estrus, the male follows her. So this is kind of a model. This is from that paper, kind of the flow chart of the decisions that chimpanzees are making in this virtual world. If you're a female, you look for fruit. If you find fruit, you go to fruit. If you find and eat it, and then rest, and then wander around looking for more fruit. If you don't find fruit, you look for protein. If you don't find protein, you wander around looking for more things to eat. If you're a male, the rules are a little bit different in this world. So you look for other chimps first. If you find another chimp, you go towards that chimp. If it's female, whoops, you follow her, and she's in estrus, you follow her. And if not, then you go and look for fruit. So some very simple behavioral rules. And the very cool thing that excited me was that from those simple behavioral rules, you get some really fascinating results. So this is simulated chimps here. Oakhurst and Hogeberg found that their simulated chimps, females, spent more time alone than males did. That's what we see over here, with females being solitary in groups of size 1, much more than males, and in smaller party size on average. So females spend more time. Then they compared those model data with data from Gombe. And so that's what we're looking at here. The model data on the top, the field data down below. Solitary females are more common than solitary males. both in the model and in the field. And males are more often found in unisex and mixed groups than females are in the model world and in real chimps as well. So there was a really nice match to the Gombe data. Here's just another view of that same kinds of data. The model was robust to a range of parameter values for how many females were there, what the size of the trees were, how many trees had protein, how much fruit was in those trees. And males consistently were in larger and more often in mixed sex groups than females. And the cool thing, 20 years on, 28 years on, looking at some of our results from spider monkeys, and this may be one of the only pictures of monkeys that you'll see in this talk, our results from spider monkeys, show very, very similar patterns, right? It's much more common for females to be in solitary groups. That's what most of this all female bar over here on the left is, and for males to be in mixed sex groups or in unisex parties. So the key emergent results, in addition to male sociality and female solitariness that came out of this cool model, is that males parties aggregate around estrus females. You see extensive temporal fluctuation from time step to time step in the model in party size, and you see conspicuous differences in ranging patterns with males going farther each day than females, all of which also characterize spider monkeys, which at the time Peter was trying to get me interested in studying the behavioral ecology of. So with that all said, and me getting super excited about that paper yet again, I want to kind of give an overview of what I want to talk about for the rest of today. I'm going to give a brief introduction to agent-based simulation modeling, an overview, what some of the elements of models and agents are, and then why this approach I think is really cool for thinking about primate social behavior and social evolution. I'll give a super short history of agent-based simulation models use in primatology. I've given some of that history already, and I am delighted that Charlotte Hemmelrich is here as well, because she's done, again, talk about being in a place where you're a fanboy with all of the illustrious folks whose papers you've read for 30 years. Charlotte, it's really a delight to see you here. And folks can ask you questions about some of your models instead of me. I want to give two examples then, and this is what I hope I'll spend the most on, two examples of my own work with agent-based modeling in primatology, and then a couple of comments, because I mentioned this if we have time for it, on the use of agent-based simulation models in teaching. So an intro to agent-based simulation modeling, as we all know, right? Models are simplified representations of components and processes that go on in what we would call the real world in nature. And the purpose of models is to gain intuition and insight. Models are invariably imperfect and incomplete. And so, every one of us, I'm sure, is familiar with George E.P. Box's quote, essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So that's why we do modeling. Now, there are a couple of types of modeling that I want to distinguish because I want to focus on agent-based simulation or computational models. So some models are verbal arguments, right? Darwin's articulation of evolution by means of natural selection. Some models that many of us are familiar with from introductory ecology classes, from teaching about ecology and natural selection, are analytical models, right? They're mathematical or statistical models, and Lotka-Volterra equations or various kinds of regression models are nice examples of analytical models. And then there's what I'm talking about today, which are simulation models or computational models. So whereas analytical models are using deterministic equations or generate deterministic equations that describe some change in a variable of interest over time or in response to changes in other variables of interest, for example, the relationship between population density and food availability, simulation models are different. So a classical example of an analytical model would be the classic Lotka-Volterra equations, whether in their discrete or continuous form, where the rate of change in the size of a population of prey is related to their growth rate, but also the predators that are there in the environment and how effective those predators are, and vice versa. The rate of change in population size in a predator is related to how many prey items are around and how efficient those predators are, as well as the natural rate of decline of mortality of those predators. And so with Lotka-Volterra equations and these kind of very simple analytical models, you can get cyclical patterns, right, with respect to how prey numbers change in response to changes in predator numbers and vice versa. So that's a classic analytical model that many of us will be familiar with. Simulation models are a bit different. They focus not so much on those deterministic rules or patterns, but they focus on the outcome of interactions between individual agents and their environment, or interactions between individual agents among themselves based on behavioral rules like the kind that I mentioned. So, classic example of predator-prey dynamics in a simulation model. Some of you guys will be familiar with the NetLogo modeling environment, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But you set up a world where there are agents of different type. In this case, there are sheep and there are wolves and there are food patches. Those agents follow rules. If you're a sheep, if you're on grass, then you eat. If not, you wander around. If you have enough energy, you reproduce. If you meet a wolf, then you die. And the wolf rules: wander around. If you encounter sheep, then chase that sheep. If you catch the sheep, then you eat it. And if you have enough energy, then you as a wolf will reproduce. And so just to show you some kind of cool visualizations, here's that kind of dynamic agent-based simulation model that's analogous to the Lotka-Volterra or classic predator-prey cycling model. You can see the number of sheep and the number of wolves is increasing and decreasing cyclically over time. So that's an example of a simulation model. Now, analytical models, just to some other contrasts in these different modeling approaches, analytical models also often imply that there's homogeneity to the modeling environment. There are homogeneous populations or classes of individual, like sheep or wolves, and simulation models, the environment's often heterogeneous or heterogeneous. The actors are instantiations of a class that can vary from one to another, and the actions of agents are really dependent on their location in the landscape. So many, at least the kinds of simulation models I'm talking about, are spatially explicit. Analytical modeling is a top-down approach. It emphasizes systems level parameters. It emphasizes equilibrium conditions, whereas simulation modeling is a more bottom-up approach. It's concerned with the changing states of individual agents, the behavior of individual agents, and whatever global patterns you see are built up or emerge from local interactions. This is exactly what was so exciting about that paper by Thibaut, Kirsten, and Hogeweg. Simulation models emphasizes dynamics, and they are often result in kind of self-organized behavior. And a kind of classic example of self-organization and collective action is provided by a simple flocking algorithm that's known as Boyd's algorithm, which I'm sure many of you have seen before. Agents following just a few simple rules in response to local environmental conditions about the locations and direction and movement of other agents can generate groups that have coordinated movement. So you can see we start off from a disarray of birds, simulated birds flying in a 3D environment, and with just a few very simple rules, you get the emergence of collective behavior and collective coordinated movement. So in agent-based simulation models, the modeler is who defines the environment and its features. And so that's a critique of agent-based simulation modeling, right? That we have control over what we model, what we include in our model. And so, you know, in theory, we can probably tweak a model to get any kind of result that we want. But in general, what we try to do when we do agent-based modeling is to imagine the environment and its features or to inform how we model the environment and its features by natural observations. So the dimensions, components, and phenomena that occur within an environment, like foraging, like reproduction, like predation, we have to make some explicitly, some explicit decisions about how we model those. One of the advantages, we have to be explicit, right? So people can go and challenge how we've modeled how predation acts, how foraging works. The modeler defines the agents that exist in the environment, their perceptual abilities, their cognitive capacities, the behavioral rules that they follow. You can have multiple agents or classes. Each one of them is an individual, and the features of agents can be adapted, right? The rules that agents follow, the behavioral rules, can change with experience, with learning in response to the behavior of other agents. And so that makes it really ideal for modeling complex systems. So agents in ABSM, agent-based simulation models, are autonomous. They control their own actions. They're social. They interact or can interact with other agents. They're reactive. So they perceive things about the environment and they respond. They're proactive, so they have motivations, goals, desires. I need to get enough food today if I'm going to survive. And typically we model agents as following a sense, think, act cycle, where we collect information, our agents collect information, evaluate that information, and then act on the basis of that information. Often we model agents as being individually variable, mobile, communicative in some way with one another, and having some kind of memory. So why is agent-based simulation approach, why is that approach to modeling useful in primatology? Well, I think I would argue that, and we can discuss this, primates are complex, right? Maybe more so than other groups of organisms, although maybe that's a straw thing that I got to put up there, but primate species are long-lived. Most live in social groups with overlapping generations. So you have one or more than one same and opposite sex individual that you're interacting with. You have sustained social interactions with both group members and extra group individuals over long periods of time. There can be lots of variation in age and body weight and experience among individuals, in kin among individuals. Primates and lots of other taxa, but primates exhibit coalitionary and coordinated behavior, such as in movement, group defense, intergroup interactions. They exhibit complex social behavior, like retaliation, dominance hierarchies, triadic interactions. So all of those things are really part of a complex system that's not easy to model analytically, and that's why I think the simulation approach is very, very cool. So riffing on this, the title of Hannah Coco's great book on modeling, primatologists and other interesting people want to understand how those emergent features of the interactions of how those features of social systems come about and the effects of those on, for example, population genetic structure. So to what extent do those complex features emerge from simple behavioral rules? That's exactly the question that motivated the work by Hoogeweg and colleagues that so excited me 30 years ago, that keeps me getting excited. You can probably hear me getting excited here. Do these behaviors that we see, the social complexity that we see, does it require kinship? Does it require special cognitive abilities? Lots of folks think it does, but does it really? So that's my kind of intro up to short history of ABSM's use in primatology. I'm going to not talk very much more about the use in primatology, because I do want to jump to some of the modeling or other folks' use of ABSMs in primatology, because I want to jump to some other some results and models that I've been working on. But I do want to, again, just shout out the classic origins of ABSM and primatology. Really started with this mirror world. The chimp world was a derivative of the mirror world that Pauline Hoogeweg and colleagues began working with and exploring more than 35 years ago. So this, an artificial world that consists of a space that's subdivided into different regions where agents wander around and try to survive and do things. The key results, again, simple rules that in the paper that I alluded to were slightly different for males and females, resulted in self-structuring and many emergent qualities similar to those that were seen in chimpanzees. Sociality, male sociality, aggregation around estrus females, temporal variation in party size, and so on. So the real intellectual outcome of that mirror world has been a proliferation of models that Charlotte Hemmelrich and others, colleagues, collaborators, and other research groups have developed, that really explores a bit of a different kind of space in the mirror world. So it's an extension of the mirror world. You have a homogeneous space where agents have two tendencies, not looking for food and conspecifics for mating per se, but rather looking for individuals to group with, and in some cases then having interactions with those individuals. So this dom world or dominance world that Hemmelrich and others have used to explore, have worked on, they've explored such things as the emergence of dominance relationships within groups, including the emergence of despotic versus egalitarian societies. They've looked at the emergence of redirected aggression, intersexual dominance, the role of intersexual attraction in the emergence of dominance relationships. So this dom world that Hemmelrich and others have modeled has been extended, it's been replicated, it's been challenged in some aspects by others, but it's really cool and fundamental to thinking about and exploring the way in which, or the extent to which, some of the complex features of primate social behavior emerges from local scale interactions among agents following very discrete behavioral rules. So I'm going to jump through and just highlight, there's been a wealth of papers that Charlotte Hemmelrich and colleagues have published. The key result from many of those is that these simple rules can result in the emergence of both spatial structuring and social structuring. So without going into any of the details of their models, some of the things that they demonstrated is in their virtual DOM world, hierarchies can develop, dominance hierarchies can develop from an initial egalitarian state among agents. That with higher intensities of aggression, the hierarchies tend to be more despotic. So the more likely an aggressive interaction, a dominance interaction, is to result in a dramatic change in dominance rank, then you're going to see more despotic hierarchies, a wider variation between individuals in dominance ranks. And that's what I'm showing here. These are two figures from an excellent review in 2017 that Hemmelrich and others put together. So hierarchies are developing this dominance values over time from an initial egalitarian state, and with higher intensity of aggression, hierarchies become more despotic. In addition, some of their results suggest that you see greater peripheralization of subordinates in more despotic societies. And that's, here's a nice figure that shows that. These are high-ranking individuals, and then just because this is a spatially explicit environment in which dominance interactions take place in the DOM world, the locations of individual agents, and you can look at their average position in space over time, and more dominant individuals end up more central, more subordinate individuals more peripherally. So that interesting peripheralization of low-ranking individuals then emerges just from these dominance interactions, as opposed to any kind of tendency for dominance to want to be in the center of a spatial group or of a social group. And then one other result that I just thought I would point to is more despotic dominance hierarchies. From their work, more despotic dominance hierarchies result in less cohesive groups. So more egalitarian groups are more cohesive. And I think, and Dr. Hemmelrich could correct me on this, but I think the argument for that is, well, if you're egalitarian, you're going to be tolerating having other individuals close by to you. Okay, so let's spend the last bit of time that we have together talking about some examples from my own work. So there are two models that I want to talk about that I've been working on developing over the last 5 to 10 years. I'm really slow when I do computer programming, despite loving it. One is, I call it Sim-Primate. It's an agent-based primate socio-ecology simulator. And this is really growing out of the work that I started with Peter 30 years ago. It's still unfinished, but the objective is really to explore the influence of ecological variables, food distribution and predation risk, and social variables, demography, et cetera, on grouping and subgrouping behavior in non-human primates. And so this model has a couple of design goals, wanted it to be generalizable across a range of primates and scalable to different world sizes, thinking about that incredible variation in primate social systems that we see among primates in the New World. I wanted it to be able to incorporate realistic environmental parameters and dynamics, such as about resource distribution, patch size, and seasonality in how resources are distributed in the world. And I wanted it to be able to incorporate set-specific features for the primate agent classes that are included in the model. Things like differences between males and females in movement capacities, nutritional needs, physiology, sensory abilities, et cetera. And I had some emergent qualities that I'm trying to target to see the extent to which these kind of come up out of first principles. First, can the model generate a range of group sizes? Can it generate fission-fusion dynamics, which is something I'm particularly interested in working on woolly monkeys and spider monkeys? Can it generate sex differences and association patterns and in inter-individual distances? Can it generate reasonable activity patterns, so daily food intakes and ranging patterns? And eventually, I would love it, it's not here yet, eventually I'd love it to include the evolvability of behavioral strategies so that we can look at individuals playing different behavioral strategies over time and then reproducing do you see natural selection in this kind of virtual world? Not there yet. The decision rules for the model are really grounded in those of the mirror world and in flocking models that I've discussed already. So first off, individuals' search for food is primary. If an individual detects a patch with food, it moves to it, it feeds until it's sated or until the patch is empty, and then it moves on. If it doesn't find food, it evaluates the social milieu and it coordinates with other group members, that should say. So these are, fundamental things that are part of the mirror world, fundamental things that are part of some other agent-based simulation models. I've working on programming this in a computer language called NetLogo, which is a high-level object-oriented programming language that's really designed specifically for agent-based simulation. I can talk about NetLogo and all of the cool things about it with anyone afterwards if you're interested, but NetLogo allows for a couple of different types of agents, including turtles, which would be things that we think of as mobile agents typically, patches, and links between those. It's easy to learn. It provides immediate rewarding visual feedback. It can integrate with R and with Python, and so it's really powerful, much more powerful than I think some people give it credit for being, and it is free. So I'm throwing up the URL there. If anybody hasn't explored it and would like to, there's some wonderful resources at that URL. Here's a glimpse at the Sim-Primate interface, and there's a lot of little sliders and things that you can play with here. I'll talk through a couple of these. The first thing that we need to do when we run a Sim-Primate model is to set up the forest. And so the resource distribution in the environment can be simulated on the basis of several different parameters: number of patches per hectare, mean number of fruits per hectare, standard deviation in fruit patches per hectare, how long patches are fruiting for, how much patch turnover there is from month to month. And so the objective with this was with setting up a variable environment where a modeler could tweak the way that resources are distributed is a direct outgrowth of what Peter and I were trying to do 30 years ago. So I'm just going to show you a couple forest dynamics here. I'm going to start all of these playing. Can you all see the video okay? Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can, that'd be great. These are 3 simulated forests of different size. The left-hand one is a 4-hectare one. The middle one is a 16-hectare one. The right one is a 100-hectare one. And I've just set for each one some arbitrary number of patches per hectare with mean fruits per hectare and a standard deviation in fruits per patch. And you can see that this is going through time, right? And you're seeing resources pop in, grow, and recede. And then there's a shift across time in how those resources are distributed. I'm not doing anything with clumpiness here. So these are all fairly, these are all random distributions of fruits, but you can tweak clumpiness as well. Let's move on. The agent setup. There's a lot of different ways that you can tweak the behavior of male and female agents, but the behavior of male and female agents is determined by a bunch of different parameters, including the rate at which food is consumed and digested by males versus females. So you can play with different body sizes kind of indirectly that way. And then the number of meters that males versus females move per step. Technical thing, each step is 10 minutes. Animals are active from dawn to dusk. They don't do anything at night except for digest. And then the grouping behavior between individuals is modeled using a modification of the mirror world and flocking algorithm approach. And so here's just a couple videos of individuals. This is one individual foraging in that 4-hectare environment. You can see the path that it's taking. The trees that are lighting up white are, given the parameters that I set, the ones that are detectable by that individual. Here's a second simulation where we've got 2 individuals foraging in a forest, and it's just again, you can see they're traveling along together. They're seeing trees together. You can see them eat, and the size of the tree reduces. And then here's, whoops, that one doesn't look so good. And then here's a third example of group foraging where the toolkit is going to show you links between the individuals, and the simulation can keep track of those inter-individual distances and characterize them over time. So I've really just started playing with this model, picking it up again after about 5 years. Some preliminary runs of the model. I looked at the relationship between the social radius, how far away individuals are responsive to and are able to cohere with the movements of other individuals. And so among simultaneous foragers, average daily food intake increases with the radius of the social field. Perhaps not surprising. If you're seeing and detecting individuals farther away and they're in a feeding tree, then you're likely to go to them and feed. If you can't detect them and you see a feeding tree more close to you, then you're going to give priority to feeding. So this example simulation was run for 1 year, and you can see the relationship between social radius and mean daily food intake. Some other preliminary runs suggest that if you tweak things just even a tiny bit, like allowing there to be a 1 meter difference in how far males versus females travel in each time step, you can get some strong sex segregation. So sex segregation emerges out of a very small behavioral difference. Now, and that's all I'm going to say about that model. I do want to say, agent-based simulation models, if you're going to use it as a scientific methodology, you need to be very concerned about verification and validation. You have to ask questions like, are the attributes of agents in the environment plausible correlates of the real world? Does the behavior that emerges match observations in the natural system that you're trying to model? And do changing parameters of the model along meaningful biological dimensions have emergent results that are similar to those seen in the real world? And that's a challenge. I will say for this particular model, that's a real challenge. It's really hard to get agents to stay together, given that feeding has primacy. And this is some of the same challenges that Peter and I found 30 years ago when we were working on a similar problem. It's not realistic that primate groups kind of split up as much as they do in this model. Most primate groups remain cohesive. So I mentioned that specifying a larger social radius helps them stay together, but there are probably better, maybe more biologically appropriate rules to promote cohesion that I think need to be explored. The second model I want to talk about is one that I've published a little bit on, and it's a model that I call Genesis, which is a forward time population genetics simulation toolkit. And it has a somewhat different objective, and it's really to explore what are the consequences that we as geneticists or as budding geneticists might expect to see given different primate social systems. So, many of you will be familiar with some image like this, right? This is a classic Fisher-Wright scenario of randomly mating populations or demes that are connected to one another by gene flow. So classic Fisher-Wright population genetics statistics kind of model populations in a very particular way where individuals within those populations are largely homogeneous, and we characterize the gene pool in a very crude way, counting the number of alleles and the proportion of all of the alleles in the population that are represented by alleles of a particular type. That kind of structure is not, as we all know, not something that characterizes primate populations, right? So I'm just honing in on this population down here in the lower right corner. You could imagine that there's lots of different ways that social structure and social systems, very different social systems can be represented in that same deme. You can have large multi-male, multi-female groups where there's a lot of reproductive skew. You could have small pair-living or cooperatively breeding groups over here on the right. Same number of individuals, same age and sex distribution, but a very different mating system, right? So that's part of what primate social systems, that diversity that we see in primate social systems, is very apparent and widespread. So we need a toolkit that you can use to model the effects of social systems and social structuring. Also, we know that primates live in landscapes where the suitable habitat risk, suitable habitat, predation risk, distribution of foods is not uniform across the landscape. And so if you try to model gene flow across a landscape like this with a purely deme-based model, it's really not going to accurately characterize the way in which some parts of a landscape are going to be sinks for the distribution of alleles, and others may be sources for the distribution of alleles. It doesn't allow you to model kind of the changing resistance of the landscape. And so the point of the Genesis toolkit is really to allow both of these things allow us to do both of these things. So lots of population genetic simulators don't accommodate social system features, and this toolkit is designed to allow us to accommodate those, and looking at how allele frequencies are likely to change and population structure is likely to change into the future over time. It allows us to model overlapping generations, sex-biased, condition-based, parallel dispersal, variable vital rates, dominance-based mating, et cetera, different group formation processes, individual decision-making in all of those contexts. Other population genetic simulators that exist already aren't spatially explicit. So some of these variables above are going to depend on location. So again, here's a screenshot of what all of the parameters that you can maybe tweak in this model or play with in this model are, and then ways for getting data in. I just threw it all up here so that you can see some of the complexity. The model works by loading in a population data file or creating a population data file for simulation. And for those of you guys who have worked with other population genetics softwares, this is a pretty, it's very similar to other kinds of data files for Genesis or for GenePop or GenLX data files. We also load in a vital rates data file, which kind of encapsulates the demography of the population that we're modeling, and you can play with this. This should be informed by what we know from demography and demographic life history variables in wild populations or captive populations. The toolkit allows you to then position individuals and groups across a landscape in a spatially explicit way. You can load in a map, you can load in an image and place groups on top of the landscape. It allows you to then also specify attributes of the landscape, such as the habitat matrix's permeability or resistance to gene flow. So some parts in the landscape, like a river, may be a barrier to gene flow, and you can accommodate that in the toolkit. Some areas are maybe associated with greater risk. So I'm imagining, we've got some matrix over here between patches of forest that maybe has higher predation risk associated with it. And all of that can be incorporated in the toolkit. The simulation settings then allow you to tweak mating, dispersal, degree of reproductive skew, and or reproductive suppression between males and females, and even include infanticide as a selective factor. And then a similar flow chart to what we've seen for some of these other models, right? This over here on the left is all how we load data into the simulation, but then what happens? Individuals, each time step, maybe die, maybe emigrate, maybe reproduce, and age. If they emigrate, they maybe join a group and then kind of pop back into that cycle over and over again. Where we specify what is likely to impact survival, how dispersal takes place, how mating takes place, and how the population is regulated. And it will then write out genetic data, genotype data from individuals who are born, who their parents are, where they are in the landscape, what dispersal events they've undertaken in their lifespan, their virtual lifespan, and so that we can analyze that post hoc. So the output are these easily opened and edited text files. You get a complete record of paternity, maternity, natal and final resident populations, social group, offspring history, the number of offspring, dispersal history, et cetera. So I've done some of the development of this model with my graduate student, Lena Valencia, who's shown here on the left, and another wonderful graduate student shown in the center. But, Lena and I used this model to look at simulated tamarins. So I'm going to briefly talk about two sets of results of running this model or using this toolkit. One was we were interested in tamarin mating systems, so polyandry, monogamy, and polygyny, and then reproductive suppression. So two things that we did with simulated tamarin data, we set up an initial population of tamarin groups, 36 social groups arranged on a hexagonal grid in a world of roughly 1,600 hectares, kind of pretty similar to tamarin density in the wild. We set up a each of those groups to have a particular sex ratio, a particular age composition, and then genotypes of individuals in those groups. We allowed for some immigration from the outside world, and we used life history parameters, a vital rates file that was based on populations of captive and wild callitrichians. And just to show you what this model then looks like as a run of it, each of these is a social group, and you've got individuals moving around this environment, possibly dispersing more than once. We set some of the conditions that we were exploring was looking at differential dispersal by males and females, whether or not females would disperse with kids, but you see some kids popping up here. Those are the small male and female symbols. So there's a lot of demography and dispersal going on and mating going on in this simulation. And we can let it then run for hundreds and hundreds of generations. So we did this for a couple of mating system conditions: monogamy, polyandry, polygyny, and then monogamy with different forms of either female biased or male biased dispersal. And I just want to give you a handful of results to show kind of what you can pull out of the output files from these simulations. The first one is looking, just as one example, at relatedness, how relatedness between average individuals within groups, how average female-female relatedness, how average male-male relatedness, and how average between group relatedness changes over time as a function of simulation year, right? So you see an initial increase in mean relatedness in all four of these categories within 25 years or so of the start of the simulation, where everything is kind of homogeneous, and then an accumulation of relatedness within groups. And that's because dispersal's limited. What we're looking at with each line here are groups that are different numbers of home ranges away from one another. So close, I'll get back to that in just a second. Another thing that we can look at is, because we have the simulation output at the end of multiple hundreds of years, there are lots of individuals, simulated individuals, for whom we have entire lifetime reproductive output. And that's what we're looking at right here, just as an example to show the difference in the number of offspring that females versus males have in a polyandrous versus a monogamous versus a polygynous group, or when the mating system is set to polyandry, monogamy, or polygyny. So these are the kinds of things that you can pull out of the model. You can use it to explore then what the effects of different mating systems are. And kind of by validation, we compared the relatedness estimates to empirical studies based on small numbers of groups, Seguinus mistax, Calothrix jacus, after 25 years into the simulation. And to our, not surprise, but confidence building, I guess, the average relatedness and kind of other elements of population structure look very similar from the simulation output compared to empirical studies. We did one other thing, which is to look at the effect of landscape features, and this was published in 2014. So basically the same setup, but where we put a barrier that separated the landscape into a northern and a southern half, and that barrier we let then be permeable in some instances, more permeable, less permeable here, and look at how the effect of a barrier influences the accumulation of genetic differentiation between social groups on the same side versus opposite sides of the barrier, and closer versus farther distances away. So there's lots of other things that can be explored with the simulator, different social structures, mating systems, and dispersal regimes. I'd love to chat with some of y'all about tweaking this toolkit to explore aspects of other model systems, because some of what we've heard through FINE has been fantastic and interesting, and I'd love to explore it. And I just want to say I'll spend 1 minute talking about teaching agent-based simulation modeling. So the learning curve working with NetLogo is gentle. It is fun. So I would encourage anybody who's considering trying to incorporate some kind of computational elements into pedagogy, that agent-based simulation modeling is a fun activity for students to engage with. They can begin coding immediately. They can tackle important, interesting questions with limited coding experience. There are great free resources available, lots of great example models, and NetLogo isn't just a kind of eye candy pretty toy for doing agent-based simulation. It can interface with R and Python, it can run in headless mode, you can automate the running of many simulations, and so it's actually a very powerful, underutilized, I think, research tool. If anyone's interested, I'd be happy to share sample syllabi that I've used for teaching agent-based simulation modeling. And here are two just programming assignments, just because I love zombies and my students love to work with zombies. From the first day in class, people are able to begin developing models that have some pretty cool complex behavior. And lastly, there's been lots of exciting student projects that have come out of the courses that I've taught. People have looked at admixture in human populations, sex bias dispersal in butterflies, spatial memory, dominance rank, gene introgression across hybrid zones, Shaffer foraging, the polygyny threshold model. So students will take this and run with it. And finally, I just want to say thank you to all the folks, especially Peter Rodman and Lena Valencia, who've been really influential in my working on agent-based modeling. With that, I will stop sharing, and I'd be happy to answer questions that folks have. I know I talked really fast, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Tony, so much. And your energy and enthusiasm is contagious. So I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm sure we'll have no shortage of questions. So for those of you who are maybe joining us for the first time, and there were some of you that I didn't recognize, but I hope you will consider emailing me or any of the fine co-organizers. So if you would be interested in being added to the email list, that way you get a reminder every week of all these wonderful talks we get on a weekly basis, or finalizing plans for our fall series. So for those of you who are new again, what we're going to do next, if this is something that we're proud, I think distinguishes the fine seminar from other series where we spend as much time listening to our colleagues as we do talking to each other and asking questions to the speaker. So we are going to spend the next hour doing that. We ask you that you please simply type a question mark in the chatting window, and I will be taking the question marks in the order that they are posted. If for some reason, we're also going to be taking questions from those of you who are listening to us through the FINE YouTube channel. It is a commitment we have, the organizers of FINE, to try to engage as much as possible our young junior scholars and colleagues who are sometimes maybe a little bit more shy than the more senior ones. So you know that we want to hear from you, we want to meet you. So sometimes I will skip over the question posed by one of our senior colleagues to give preference and priority to our junior colleagues. So with that, I see already that question marks are coming into the chatting. And our first question, really, really wonderful example of what we want to see from all the students. Jingyu, thank you so much for being here with us again. Please remember to briefly state your institutional affiliation. Jingyu, you're the first one in the list.
Yeah, hello, Anthony. It's a really interesting talk. Yeah, I'm Jingyu from, I'm PhD student from University of Strasbourg and the CNRS in Strasbourg, France. So my question is about your models. So for all those models you have simulated for the primates, do you test the similarity between the results the model is giving and the real world?
That's a great question. I have not done a lot of testing, and that's, yeah, I've not done a lot of testing with the exception of the Tamarin explorations that Lena and I were doing. And, okay. and the first model, that kind of Sim-Primate model, I would say is very unlikely to have good match with the real world right now. And I can point to, I think I alluded to the fact that in that model, it's really hard to get individuals to stay together based on how I've modeled the decision cycle that individual primates have to make. There is no kind of social cohesion variable that kind of was going to attract beyond, oh, I don't want to get too far away from another individual. I want to orient towards another individual. But the primacy that's given to feeding, I think, really weakens that kind of social attractive force. And so I think there's something else that needs to be put there. It wouldn't look very much like the real world right now. You do see fissioning and fusing, right? And animals come together at feeding sources, and animals break away from one another when they detect feeding sources in different directions. And so maybe something about coordination of visual attention would help keep them together.
So you think like if you want to like make it more realistic, you still need to like to analyze the real population to find like which factor is missing.
That's right. Yes, and I would say with the population genetics simulator, that's really where Lena and I have done that kind of exploration, and based on first principles, exactly what we would expect to see about the relationship between genetic distance and geographic distance, about exactly what we would expect to see about the effects of barriers on restricting gene flow. Those are all well substantiated with the toolkit. But I would love to explore that in systems other than tamarins or other than simulated tamarins.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Sean O'Donnell. Sean?
There we go. Hey, everybody. Sean O'Donnell. I'm a professor at Drexel University in Philadelphia, and known Tony for a long time, back to when he was a grad student and I was a young postdoc at UC Davis. If Peter's still on, howdy to Peter also. So Tony, I'm really super excited about the potential for using these kinds of models and programming as tools for teaching. And I just kind of wanted to make a comment, and I think you kind of intimated this when you showed that really impressive list of projects that students have produced on a range of topics. But it really strikes me that it seems likely anyway that it would be relatively easy to change the details, or in a sense the description of the biology of the various parameters that you build into these models, so that they can suit almost any ecological and social behavioral system that you're interested in. And so it's really clear that it's not just about working on primate foraging or working necessarily even in forests, right? I mean, I could just imagine, applying these kinds of approaches to lots of different systems. And I think that just makes it a really powerful and exciting teaching tool.
Totally agree with you, Sean. That's why I try to refer to these as toolkits rather than as models, right? It's a toolkit for looking at the effects of social systems on population genetic structure. It's a toolkit for looking at the effects of resource distribution on ranging patterns and coordination.
The next question is from Marion Dellinger. Marion?
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really nice. I'm a PhD student at Hólar University, Iceland. Well, I work mostly with fish, but I was wondering maybe, have you, I'm not super familiar with the tamarins and other small primates, but do you think maybe one parameter that would explain why they prefer staying together over food, let's say, could be some kind of family attachment at for example, at younger ages, something like that? Have you thought about this?
No, that's a really great suggestion. It would not be that difficult to include. So one of the things that you do when you set up an agent, you give it characteristics that are going to be individual and define that agent, right? And that agent basically carries around those characteristics with it. You could certainly include one that's a matrix of familiarity, how long you've spent in contact with, or how much time you were in contact with such and such another individual at a young age. So at least in the NetLogo modeling environment, you can have links between agents carry attributes with them as well. And so those links, they don't have to be kind of physical links. They can just be, oh, you and me, we've spent an accumulated X amount of time together, or we were together, yes or no, in a critical period. And so that would be something that could follow an agent around. And then when you interact with that other individual again, I'm just kind of thinking of this off the top of my head, when you interact with that other individual again, you could write a decision rule that then tweaks the behavior of that individual in an interaction on the basis of what those attributes are.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Because I was thinking of like maybe you could model something that somehow integrates like game theory in it. Like if I cooperated with you in finding food previously and that succeeded, maybe I'm gonna be more prone to stay with you after. Like this was just a thought of mine, but yeah, okay, thank you for the answer. That was really nice.
It's a great thought, and there are, you know, some of the students in my class have modeled kind of spatial memory in that kind of way. Like you've got a list of all the places that you visited, and whether or not the brain really works like this is a different issue, right? But you can make your agent's brain work like this. You keep track of a list of all of those places that you visited, and kind of, if you go back to them, what the change in fruit that was there since the last time, and that certainly then you can write a decision rule that you then explore. Does that different decision rule have a different effect?
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. Thanks.
Thank you.
Next question is from Nida Shahidi. Nida?
Hi, I am a postdoc in a cognitive neuroscience lab and at the German Primate Center. My question is, so in the setting of the neuroscience labs, when we're lucky, we get two animals to study social behavior. We don't get, you know, what you have, you were showing this macro scale. And by the way, the animal model that we're working with are rhesus macaques. I was wondering what we can learn from this macro scale simulation that we can apply to these dyadic settings that we have in the lab.
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know that I'm going to be able to answer that question right. Let me think. One thing. So I have seen, just this is maybe a bit tangential. I think some things that I have seen, people are using agent-based modeling for looking at kind of neural connections and learning, right? What can we learn from, so at the macro scale? I mean, if you have decision rules that you are exploring in a simulation model on a macro scale, those same decision rules, I think you could probably implement something analogous to in an experimental setup, right? So if it's familiarity that's drawing you in your simulation model to interact preferentially with one individual versus another, you could maybe study the decision rule itself on a small scale in the laboratory. I don't know if that's a good enough connection.
Okay, thank you.
Next question is from Kaya Tombak.
Hi there, I'm Kaya Tombak, postdoc of Jess Rathman's at Hunter College. For my PhD, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what selection forces influenced group size in zebras. And I ended up doing a kind of a large scale observation-based analysis on this, incorporating food availability and predation and parasite disease risk, transmission, and bachelor harassment. And I'm about to publish that now, but one of the takeaways was that each of these selection forces seem to have surprisingly weak influences on group size. And I've just been thinking a lot about why, and I wonder, A, if there's a way to add noise to any of your predictors in your models, and B, whether you think that noise could possibly actually make the emergent grouping patterns stronger in some cases and not necessarily weaker.
So it's on the first question, it's certainly possible to incorporate noise, and that's really one of the advantages of simulation and being able to do lots of simulations and you know, have fast computers that allow you to explore the parameter space in a robust way. And so in these models, there's a lot of stochasticity in the two models that I presented in terms of what allele gets chosen or what your likelihood of dispersing is, right? So those are, the models are drawing out of distributions the same, and you can specify those distributions. I'm using Gaussian or gamma distributions, but you could make up your own noisy distribution to have a random variable be drawn from if you wanted to incorporate noise and explore the influence of noise systematically. So I think modeling is a great way to do that. I mean, whenever you do Bayesian kind of statistical analyses, that's what we're doing, right? We're exploring that parameter space and we're saying what the distributions are that we're going to be that we think are going to represent our parameters. With respect to, do I think that noise could enhance the emergent qualities? I think it would probably depend on what the emergent quality is, right? So if the emergent quality is something about the coefficient of variation in something, for example, in the DOM world models that Hemmelrich and colleagues have looked at, one of the ways that they characterize how despotic a dominance hierarchy is by looking at the coefficient of variation in dominance scores, right? So I do think that noise could probably make some parameters that you're interested in, some emergent parameter that you're interested in, appear more important than if you don't have noise in the system. But that's just kind of a gut thought.
Thank you.
I'm listed next, and since we're doing well on time, I'm gonna comment. I want to make a comment, Tony, and hear from you on my comment. A little bit in relationship to what Anita, you may remember a few minutes ago, was telling us how we can get from this modeling exercise when you're suddenly studying only two animals in a neuroscientific context. And Tony, you and I have always been searching and exchanging ideas on how to engage the students. And what I feel is, that I profoundly believe in the usefulness of these modeling exercises. But sometimes what I feel is that those of you doing it feel like they need to justify or you're doing a great job of acknowledging the limitations. Now, what I'm thinking in trying to recruit the interest of students in exploring this tool for the toolkit, to what extent do you think it's really that different, the severe limitations of your explicit modeling exercise from any kind of, say, behavioral data collection protocol that we implement in the field? So the truth is that, and I wonder if we could recruit the students to reflect that, listen, you are already having, sometimes what I feel is that the students don't realize the endless limitations in regards to describing the real world that we have when we collect data. So maybe if we make them more aware that, listen, you're not describing the real world when you're observing the primates. At the most, you're describing your real world, not the primates. So if it can help us make them see that, I mean, the uncertainties are not that different. I mean, they may be of different types, but who knows if the range of uncertainty when I go and do a behavioral follow, or I study communication in the field without really knowing what an owl monkey listens or smells or sees. In a way, we're modeling. And also, all of them who may be reluctant to take on your suggestion, then go and model their data. So more and more, we're seeing that eventually they present their data with an awful lot of modeling assumptions. So I wonder if this can help them see that, listen, this is just another way of exploring things the same way you do it with your behavioral data.
So I have one real, I have an important thought about that. So one of the things that I think is really cool with these modeling approaches, you can say, I can say what happened to every individual, every generation in one of these simulations. And I could then go and behaviorally sample from that data in a way that would be maybe similar to what, to reflect the incomplete information that we have when we sample from a wild population. And so you can look at the extent to which sampling from the model results, the way that we would sample from the real world, recapitulates what the modeling results and whole tell us? I mean, I think that's a cool exercise, and one that students could certainly explore, right? They could make a model where they get all the data and then subsample from that data and look at the extent to which it recapitulates the parameters that went into building that data.
Thank you. We need to, I hope they won't be as afraid as I have been of getting into this. That's what I wish I could get them to do, because I really believe in the power of all this. Next question comes from Adriana.
Hi, Tony. Hi, everyone. Adriana Maldonado from Universidad de Rosario in Colombia. Thanks, Tony, for such a great talk. My question is more about curiosity on your first model. I'm familiar with the approach you have, but I was curious on how did you define the links when you were talking about the model where you have the emergent social structure? I think it was the first model of your two examples. And I wasn't sure if you were using just a spatial proximity or if you have any probably homophily rule that make them interact. Was it an interaction? Was it an association? How did you get at that?
in the foraging model when I drew links then between the individuals. Yeah. So that was just every possible link between every individual that was wondering when you saw the lines kind of appear there. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I just asked NetLogo to draw links between every mobile agent. Now those links are then going to be between males and females. Some of them are going to be male-male links. Some of them are going to be female-female links. Some of them are going to be between individuals that are far apart from one another, and some between individuals that are close to one another. I wasn't distinguishing that in the visual representation of those links. How could you, so some things that I think that there are statistical approaches that you could use to say, okay, this set of individuals is in two subgroups now, right? And so then that gets into how you define a subgroup as animals within particular proximity. And then, and then I could maybe split those links on the basis of the subgroup that an individual belongs to, so that you would see then two different sets of linked individuals wandering around. That's all, to me, that's all kind of data processing that you can do afterwards and say, oh yeah, well, I let these, because each individual is following its own rules in that particular model. And the rules are pretty simple ones. They're very similar to the DOM world and mirror world and flocking models, in that animal work first looks in front of it in a particular arc and sees at a certain distance ahead whether or not there's trees, or detects at a certain distance ahead whether or not there's trees with fruit in it. If there are, they're going to choose the biggest one of those and move to it. And if they don't see that, then they're going to orient towards an individual that they can detect. And so that's what keeps animals together, orienting towards individuals when they're not at other individuals when they're not at a feeding tree, or coalescing on the same feeding tree. And so that's why I was saying that I think, having food as primary breaks social systems, breaks social groups.
I see. But then basically the social structure is emerging from the sort of food distribution pattern, and not from the tendency of animals to socially interact with others.
It's emerging from both of those, and it's going to depend, at least in this model, it's emerging from both of those, and it's going to depend on specifically on the perceptual abilities of the animal and the relative attention that they pay and distance that they pay attention at to conspecifics versus food.
Okay.
Now there is predation built into that model as well, in that if you are closer to other individuals, your per capita predation risk is lower, right? So kind of a geometry of the selfish herd thing going on.
Mm-hmm.
It basically, the model, at least right now, detects how many individuals are within a certain radius of you and scales your predation risk by the density of individuals around you. It scales it in a linear way. And so I think if you scaled it in a non-linear way, then you could get, and you let individuals, when they reproduce, kind of inherit from their parents some kind of measure of how socially tolerant they're going to be, how much proximity they're going to want to keep to other individuals, then you could get emergent grouping and kind of the evolution of a behavioral rule that animals are following. Oh, keep this, I want to stay within 10 meters versus within 30 meters of other animals. But I haven't gotten that far yet.
Awesome. I'd love to chat more about it, but so far, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Before I take the next question, I want to apologize to our colleague, Loriana Chaverri. I still get nervous when I need to host, and I forgot. Usually what we do is announce our next week talk, and I want to do that before some of you need to leave. So next week, we're going to be listening from Gloriana Chaverri. I know she was here at the seminar, and then she needed to go. I apologize to her. She's at the Universidad de Costa Rica, and she'll be presenting on vocal communication and group coordination in this wing batch. So once again, that's our presentation next week. Please email me if you'd like to be added to the email list and you haven't yet. So I go back to the next question, which is, we are gonna hear from Lindelani Makuya. Lindelani?
Okay, thanks, Eduardo. Hi, everyone. So my name is Lindelani, as mentioned, and I'm a PhD student at the University of the Witwatersrand here in South Africa. And I'm working on understanding the costs and benefits of solitary living, with the main focusing on the bush karoo rat. So my question is, based on the model, I see a lot of the species you've worked on are more characterized as the more social species. So has the models you've used been applied to more solitary species or less social species?
The two models that I talked about, I've only modeled, I've only kind of had in my head social species. That said, the agents in these models are individuals, right? And so there is, at least in the first model, there's a tendency of individuals to move, actually in both of the models, right? There's a tendency of individuals to move into social groups in the second model. And in the first model, there's this kind of flocking tendency. Animals want to individuals want to keep a minimum distance away from others, but also coordinate with others. So no, I haven't really explored in either of these two models kind of individual, at the individual, I think what you're kind of thinking of. So being solitary versus not being solitary. There's certain, I would love to have done that more.
Do you think it is possible to apply the models?
Absolutely.
We can try it.
I mean, maybe not these particular models, because I do have I'm interested in cohesion and coordination, but I think the approach is very amenable to that issue of that question of, should I be solitary or should I forage with other individuals? Should I be solitary or should I associate with other individuals, right? And many of us think that is going to emerge from some trade-off between all of the things that we think are associated with survival and reproduction. So resource distribution, predation risk, needing to be able to find possible mates at the right time. So that would be absolutely amenable to further modeling.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the great talk again.
Next question, Maren Hoek.
Hello, my name is Maren from the University of Derby. Thanks, Tony, for the talk. I might watch it again in half speed, but and it's brilliant, just what Lindelani just said, and also Adriana and Marion. I think my very confused thoughts very much link with that, because you said that at the moment some of your models don't quite represent real life in primates, and because if you just have the feeding ecology as the main focus, it doesn't quite fit. And I was wondering whether by taking a comparative perspective, you might get at something that what's the difference between an aggregation a group living species and a really social species, in the sense of a species where sociality has something that cannot be just explained by advantages and disadvantages of living in groups. So I've been thinking, but not thinking it through, of I don't know whether you know the resource dispersion hypothesis by David MacDonald, based on work by Hans Krug, which was essentially developed around European badgers, which have a very, in Britain, they have essentially, they live in groups, but forage dispersed. In other areas of Europe, they are essentially pair living at the most. So the further east you go, the less social they are. And so he had some ideas around, depending on how patchy the distribution of foods are, group living sort of emerges because badgers need a big enough territory to have enough sources throughout the year. But if they have this territory, there is enough for everybody, so for more individuals, depending on how the distribution is. And it definitely doesn't work for all animals, and has many assumptions and predictions. But essentially, the badger is probably a very good example for a species that, at least in Britain, is social in a sense. Well, no, group living in a sense, but it's not really a social species with that much interaction. And if you look at strepsirrhines versus many of the old world or new world monkeys or apes, then you have more tight cohesion perhaps in certain aspects, but also amongst primates and also amongst other species. You have ones where some animals develop something like friendships, where they really seem to value a particular individual, and you can't really explain it with any mechanistic argument. So perhaps by looking at it from a comparative, so trying to include certain social values into the model that makes the primate model better, it might also help to understand what makes certain species special in the sense of sociality. So why do primatologists often think that primates are something different than other group living species potentially? Or are there other group living species that also are special in that respect? So what is it?
I would say that probably every species is special in some respect, right? And we're attuned to what we think, what our biases and our upbringing and our teaching and our, reading over the last 30 years kind of make us think is special about primate. And so that's what I think, why I loved Hoogeveg's approach is seeing the extent to which things that we maybe think of as special can emerge from very simple rules, right? That self-organization and emergence.
And what I meant was that if you look at a model that has certain very simple parameters, maybe this is representative for a certain group of taxa that have, let's say, an aggregation type of groups. And then you need another level, another explanatory variable that goes beyond predation and food, that then shows a different pattern as we find in certain primates. And if you add yet another level, you get fission fusion or whatever else. So what are these additional things that we need to explain?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think if I knew what the additional things were, that would be another, that'd be fantastic, right? I'd be super excited. I do think there are things that I haven't explored and other folks haven't explored that are likely to be important. Knowing where potential mates are and keeping track of where potential mates are, I think, is probably a general problem that mammals have to deal with, that vertebrates have to deal with, that any taxon has to deal with. And that's not explicitly incorporated into any or many socioecological, sociobiological models, right? That information tracking about the locations and cycling of or potential availability of mates so that you can be in the right place at the right time. You know, that could be a very, to me, that seems like that could be a very powerful impetus for group living if there's not a huge cost to group living in terms of reduced food availability.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Tony. We're going to hear next from Clara Jones. Clara?
Yeah, coming. Hi. Clara B. Jones, social evolution, retired mammals. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from this. And let me know if I'm misunderstanding something. But since you use a random distribution of resources, we would not, I think, according to Crook, expect the emergence of groups. It would seem to me that you would have to transition in your modeling or simulations from random to clumped in order to see that emergence and then play around with that. What do you think?
I think that could very well be the case, Clara. You know, you can, if you run that similar simulations to what I was showing the videos of with a very low resource tree density and high, and high patch size, you basically get individuals coalescing in big patches and then wandering around together until they find another big patch. And that may reflect that kind of transition to that could be the glue that keeps them together. If you've got sufficiently widely distributed resources and sufficiently large resources, such that that trade-off between the perceptual distance for food and the perceptual distance for conspecifics, and having that tendency to want to stay with conspecifics, where you get to that sweet spot. I think that's a great observation, and I think it probably is true, or would hold.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I just had my own personal experience of simple rules. I mistakenly skipped Francine's question because my simple rule was just quickly have a search image of the question mark. And Francine comes with a question mark and then it says faculty between parentheses. So my limited brain went with a simple rule. So Francine, my apologies. You came before Clara, but I missed it. Francine, you're next.
I just didn't want to overstep on graduate students. So yeah, Tony, thanks for a great talk, and it's great to see you. And thanks everybody for a really interesting discussion. My question is almost more of a comment and kind of like a broad perspective. So the theoretical implications of the of the modeling is really great. It's really fantastic, but it also has conservation and welfare implications. So being able to model, what space a species needs to survive, given that forests and other areas are being decimated, what do they need to survive? What food, what space, what numbers of individuals do they need to interact with, especially genetically, to maintain viable populations? So I think it's really incredibly important. And then in terms of welfare, what do animals need in captivity to be able to have, good psychological welfare, and in terms of social and physical space and complexity. So I think that's also really interesting. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you or sort of comment on is, I do work with virtual reality, testing non-human primates in virtual reality. And so we're doing something where we're creating a forest, which is very similar to what you have in your model, except this is a virtual forest. And we're changing the densities and looking at foraging patterns and so on. So we're starting first with the question of, do animals cooperate or not? Do they intentionally cooperate? So we know that animals do cooperate, but it may be non-intentional. So we're looking at intentional cooperation, and also, do they compete? So on the other side of it, and we have developed avatars of real individual primates who are in the virtual world. So I work with the bonobos in Iowa, who some of them are lexigram proficient. They do recognize themselves in mirrors and also in photographs. And so we're working with them to use these avatars, which is really cool. And then we have unknown individuals to play with. And we are presenting them with these forests that have the density of a real forest, except these guys were born in captivity. So one of our questions is, what happens when you take a captive individual, and you present them with a forest that, a chimpanzee or a bonobo or whoever, whatever primate would be navigating in, how do they solve spatial problems? How do they solve foraging problems? And if there's others in their group who they need, for instance, to recruit to hunt a monkey, who do they choose based on reputation? So if you have individuals who are more cooperative or less cooperative. So these are kind of things that we've been asking. And then your modeling is really, I feel like it's has this implication of extending it in theoretical ways that are really interesting. The other aspect of this is that we are working with people who work in AI. So we have AI agents based on game theory who are running this in modeling, so different than yours. I mean, it doesn't look as beautiful as yours. And so we're kind of coming up with different strategies. And I guess my question really is there a way, or can you see a way of us putting these things together that make this a richer way of testing non-human primates or animals in any way, non-human animals, learning strategies, understanding of space, understanding of grouping, and ranging patterns. So that's my question.
So Fran, great to see you. Super cool. That sounds like amazingly interesting work you're involved in. And I could see, you could have a real individual manipulating an agent in a world that is composed of computer agents, right? So that's one kind of possible means of integration, right? You were asked about how you could interface those two things. I mean, it seems like that would be fascinating to look at decision making, and then if those simulated agents could be responding to the decisions that a real individual is making and learn and change their behavior. I mean, it seems like that's really, really powerful way to kind of interrogate decision-making processes and what's salient social cues are like, and yeah.
Okay, great, thanks.
The next question is from Baptiste Sadugli.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the talk. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Eduardo, I see. Okay, sorry. But thanks also for the very pedagogic format of your talk. And actually, I have a question. I'm completely naive.
Baptiste, can you please let
I'm
us
sorry.
know where you are? Yeah.
Yes, I'm very sorry, Eduardo. I'm a PhD student in Julia Osner's lab at the University of Göttingen and the Dutch Primate Center. Sorry, thanks, Eduardo. And so I was wondering, conceptually, what makes a good kind of predictor, kind of an assumption that you put inside your agent-based entities, and what are you trying to see as an emergent properties? And I ask this question especially because it seems like you very often go from ecological parameters, trying to see how it might affect ranging or social parameters. And I was wondering, conceptually, where is the phylogenetic constraints in your work? How does this integrate, and how do you feel sometimes that, okay, this time I'm going to use steepness as the prerequisite for something to emerge, and sometimes I expect steepness to emerge. And maybe you were saying sometimes it doesn't always match real world data, but if we take macaques, the same species is going to be now ranging in very different environments for local resources. They still display the same general rules, probably because of phylogenetic constraint. And so I was wondering, how does this play into your work? Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I haven't thought through a lot about how you would incorporate phylogenetic constraints into into the specific agents that you let wander around. You know, I treated those as kind of black. Yeah, you know, I haven't really thought through, like, if I wanted to model a macaque agent or different macaque agents in from different species, what's the dimension that I would try to make sure that I could capture with a parameter? You know, in the case of macaques, we have good behavioral evidence that there's, you know, something about temperament, something about reactivity, something about you know, tolerance of co-feeding, or you know, that you maybe could introduce a parameter that you can then play with and see, okay, well, if I'm going to make these agents more rhesus-like on this parameter versus more Japanese macaque-like on this parameter, what's the effect then on the variable of interest? And if that variable of interest is something like the steepness or reversals in a hierarchy, or the rate of reversal in a hierarchy, you know, that may be a good way to explore it. I haven't really thought about kind of that temperament, but I mean, temperament is a variable, right? And you can operationalize it, and you can make some model world assumptions about how temperament should play into the decision rules that animals are making. I'm going to be if I'm tolerant, I'm going to, you know, be, or if I'm affiliative, I'm going to be more likely to not flee when someone approaches me, as opposed to flee when someone approaches me. So you can, you know, make your behavioral response sensitive to some parameter that, but you know, it's exploratory. And so that, you know, that's one of the critiques, as I think I alluded to, of agent-based modeling. You know, people say, oh, you can get whatever you think you want to get out of it, if you, depending on how you parameterize and the decisions that you as a modeler make about a priori about how those are going to influence the system. So, you know, that's a legitimate critique, I think.
Many thanks.
Question, Baptiste?
Yeah, they did. Thank you.
Our next question comes from Adrian. I didn't ask you. I'm assuming that there are no questions from the YouTube community, right?
No.
So then the next question is from David Alexander.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Anthony, for the talk. My name is David Huertas, and I'm from the Rosario University in Colombia. In this moment, my investigation is focused in study the relationship between the mangroves and the fish in the Colombian Caribbean. So my question is, in which aspects you think we can use the models to development strategies to conserve the endangered ecosystems?
I guess I would throw that back at you and say, well, it's probably worthwhile thinking about what you know of the behavioral biology of fishes in those particular ecosystems. Yeah, what are they eating? What's the distribution of those resources like? How big are fish schools? You know, to think about what the way in which fish that you know interact with the environment that you know, and you know, begin a modeling exercise there, so you have some idea about what's important. I don't know. I guess I would say, you know, in all of these agent-based models are, I think the ones that are compelling are informed by the biology of the animals that you're interested in, right? And so that's got to be the starting point. And then where do you see variation, you know, in school size or in depth at which they forage? You know, is that going to be based on what other folks have found? Is that response to variation in nutrient levels or oxygenation or something like that? So, you know, to get an idea of the parameters that you might want to include in a model that's then going to look at, okay, if we did this, if we change the environment in this way because a new shipping lane is going to be opened up and it's going to destroy the mangroves here. you know, I guess I come back to it, it's got to be grounded in the biology to start with before you can tweak it, play with it.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next question, Kaya Tombak.
Lou, Marin got me thinking about sort of like, you know, what kind of extra layer would be needed for sort of more social species. And it's not necessarily clear to me that it would be some other selection force other than what we're already working with, but I wonder if, I mean, it seems that solitary living especially versus social living are so qualitatively different that they must be some kind of alternate, you know, stable states, and possibly going beyond there, you know, there might be some valleys where we have different mating systems and so on. But so Richard Alexander said there's like no automatic benefits to grouping, but there are automatic costs. So I wonder if tweaking a model to find some kind of threshold for a selection force that does bring animals together, like predation risk, and also, you know, bachelor harassment, I think might be quite important, to be honest, as well.
But again, I'm sorry, Kai, what harassment?
Yeah, bachelor harassment. I think that might be an important one for another kind of cohesive force and not just predation. That might actually help you keep groups together as well if you add it in. But I wonder just if there's some way, and you alluded to working towards a model that can incorporate the evolution of behavior. So, you know, if you have sufficient generations, a number of generations with, you know, strong selection forces towards cohesion, I wonder if you can kind of find some kind of threshold of some combination of selection force and number of generations at which an individual trait like tolerance, you know, like sort of affiliation or whatever, might then find another valley, you know, in the population.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. Yeah, I agree with you. There's no, you know, I could imagine that there are places where grouping isn't costly, right? There's not an automatic cost to grouping. So
well, disease transmission risk, for example, like you're always going to have a higher probability of transmission if you are close together for contagious diseases. Or food competition. I mean, maybe, yeah, if in a super rich environment, you might be released from that a little bit, but there's always, I don't know.
It's not going to be,
chances are.
It's not necessarily going to be, I mean, I think of places like sleeping cliffs, right? Aggregating at a sleeping cliff for the first X number of individuals that get there. Well, anyway, I'm thinking off the top of my head. Maybe that's right. Far be it from me to disagree with Richard Alexander on anything, so.
I'm seeing if there are any other questions. Maren Hook.
Yeah, also going back to what Kaya said, I was also thinking about networks within groups, which goes back to what might be this addition, what is this X factor? And obviously in some species you have very complex social networks, and you probably can, if you look at it closely, you might find how more central individuals or more peripheral individuals have certain advantages or disadvantages, which also can be measured in reproductive success in one way or other. So maybe, I don't know whether it's possible to combine network theory with this modeling in some, I mean, in some sense it probably is, but in a yet more explicit way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I have not done yet, but I think it would be really cool to do is to pull out the because you can have the model keep track of where individuals go, right? And distance between individuals and who's associated, you know, as often, as much as you want. And, you know, you can probably tweak something about individuals' attributes that are going to make them do things a little differently than other individuals. So be more likely to be, in central positions, right? And so I think it'd be really cool to pull out the association data from a model, use that to describe network statistics, and then look at how those networks, those individual level network statistics are related to that parameter that you've set up that is going to have an influence on where they are. And if you then kind of iterate that on into if you get a lifetime reproductive success for those individuals from your model, you could say, okay, well, is there a difference in reproductive output for individuals who are following this kind of tolerance strategy or this kind of association strategy versus other? So I think that as a modeling exercise, there's a lot of possibility for exploring some of those ideas. I mean, you can build it, you can build in whatever you want and then look at what the data look like afterwards, right? In terms of decision rules, in terms of how how agents are going to interact with one another, in terms of where they're going to go. So it's that kind of data, rich data that we try to collect as behaviorists watching in the field, and our sample size is just really limited. But if you can set it up a priori so that your model gives you that sample size, you can explore some of the things that you might think are important in that virtual world.
Okay. Nelson, your question is next.
Thank you, Tony. It was a great presentation. My name is Nelson Galvis. I'm a PhD student from Universidad de los Andes. I have several questions. As always, every time that I see Tony's presentation, I have so many ideas to apply for my research. I was working with Tony for a couple of years in Ecuador, working with primates. But today, I wanted to ask you, Tony, how the scales of the models can influence the results. This question is because for both models, first, because you are saying that the groups or the models are showing that the individuals split, but I think that this split is also influenced by the scales. What happens if you work with small scale with a small forest? And also, I have been working in different forests, like small fragments and continuous forests. And what I saw is the behaviors patterns in this primate species that I have been working with change based on the scales. So I was wondering on that, and also how this scale can influence the results in the genetics models. I think that will be quite different if you work in a small scale and also in a big scales.
I totally agree with you that scale is very, very important. And so the objective, one of the objectives in that Sim primate model is to be able to scale it to the size of multiple groups' home ranges. But that's a small scale, right? It's not the micro scale of where animals are going from hour to hour, but it's so the spatial extent in each of those models is informed by the systems that I'm working on, recognizing that, I'm working on systems at that scale within the context of a much bigger patch of forest. So scale is almost certainly really, really important, as it always is. Now on the genetics models, I'm a little bit less concerned about it because, at least, am I less concerned about it? I mean, it's very explicit in that model. So we're counting numbers of home ranges away, and after a certain number of home ranges away, the pattern is the same as it's the asymptotes. So we've looked at a couple different spatial scales. For the foraging model, I think this is the point that Clara Jones was making, that the distribution of resources and clumpiness of resources with respect to the group spread and those perceptual abilities that are built in is going to be really important, and probably, if not deterministic, then very important in shaping the outcome. The other thing that your question got me thinking about is for one of those models, I was showing you runs that had a reflecting boundary, right? Where animals, they get to the end of the space and they'd kind of turn away from it and come back into the, not go beyond the space, right? And so I'm imagining that as, okay, that's something like a territorial group or a group that has a discrete home range, that it doesn't kind of wander and just keep wandering across the landscape, which, that's a very deliberate decision, but not every taxon, and it might be a reasonable decision for some primates or for some taxa, but not for other primates or other taxa. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just agreeing with you. Scale's really important. And it's like, the same thing that landscape ecologists and landscape geneticists talk about with the grain of, how big you rasterize your forest for calculating fragmentation is important in the results how you quantify whatever results you're getting, whatever predictors are going to go into a model.
So with that, that you are saying, so how you are sure that the individuals are splitting, like making fusion, or maybe
right.
just like basis on the scale, maybe they are small, like individuals that move away from the others.
It depends on how you define fission fusion then, right? And so again, I would need to return to the biology and say, okay, if I've got a good idea of what I think of as subgroups in spider monkeys, or what I think of as subgroups in chimpanzees, or what I think of as discrete communities or in chimps or spider monkeys, how does that then influence my interpretation of the the distribution of inter-individual distances that I'm seeing? And am I seeing kind of a set of inter-individual distances that reflect what goes on in the wild, in which case then I'm more confident, I would be more confident that the model's capturing something important. And if if it's like inter-individual distances are bimodal versus unimodal, or kind of some disjunct distribution, then I don't know, it's data visualization and data exploration that I think can help address that question of the extent to which scale is driving or important.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I have an extra comment. For me, was really
Nelson, very quickly, because we really need to start wrapping up for Tony to go teach. So if it's a short question, go ahead. If not, I need to ask that. Go ahead.
Okay. It just was surprising for me that you were like working with the NetLogo, because I was teaching NetLogo last week in my ecology class, but this is the third time, and every time it's hard for me engage to the students to be interested in simulations. So if you have like an advice to teach like a NetLogo on simulation, because it's hard to get.
How could they not be excited by simulations?
Yeah, it's hard, I think.
Can I, because it was in my mind, Nelson, I was thinking they are doing simulations all the time in their lives without realizing it. We're going to run out of time. I want to let Tony go, but I'll be happy to share in my mind as I was listening to this exciting, wonderful session of questions and answers. I was thinking about, aren't we agent-based simulators ourselves? We so much planning we do on a daily basis. But I prefer now to, I need to thank you, Tony, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation and full hour of questions and answers. We're going to now finish our